he loves me not. Is this what Donald Trump thinks to himself when he's pondering Bruce Rauner back in Washington, D.C.? We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Brian Mackey, NPR State House reporter for Illinois. Welcome, Brian.
Hello, Bruce.
And also Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science from University of Illinois, Springfield.
Good to be here.
Thanks. As we speak, or perhaps a little before we spoke, the president was in Granite City, Illinois, south of here, celebrating a steel plant. Notably absent was the Governor Bruce Rauner, who is taking some criticism, backhanded perhaps, from J.B. Pritzker, the Democratic nominee, for his failure to embrace Donald Trump. Any guesses as to why Bruce Rauner chose to skip this event in favor of, some aerospace company that he went and visited instead?
Yeah, it was in McChesney Park.
Yeah.
As you have suggested, there's a he loves me not aspect to Governor Rauner, although it's been mostly not over the past few years in terms of President Trump. The governor is a Republican running in what is still, in many ways, a blue state. He campaigned by studiously avoiding the type of issues that raised the hackles of Democrats back in 2014. He famously said he doesn't have a social agenda, and
unions aren't on my forefront.
Right, he did not. He actually said he did not have a specific agenda regarding unions, which turned out not quite to be the case. But he has, he's very conscious that he is a Republican governor in a blue state, and so. Seeing as how President Trump lost to Secretary Clinton by, about 19 points, he has felt apparently the need to distance himself. There was a long stretch of time where he didn't even say the president's name, and he still rarely does.
Sure.
But on the other hand, as I'm sure Kent will allude to, he has a problem with his base. He barely won the Republican
We don't
primary.
have problems, we have issues.
Well, fine, he has an issue with his base.
Okay.
And he really needs to, if he wants to be reelected, he needs conservatives to hold their nose over the things he's done on, measures to increase the trusting relationship between immigrant communities and law enforcement, which some conservatives have derided as, quote unquote, sanctuary bills. Mm-hmm. He needs to, have conservatives get over the action he took to sign a bill that allows for public funding of abortion in Illinois. Mm-hmm. And he needs them to hold their nose and vote for him. And so that's where we've seen him somewhat embrace President Trump, or at least Vice President Pence, or the Trump administration at large, if not the president himself.
Yeah. What was that event in Rosemont, Friday the 13th, this month? He introduced the vice president at an event in Rosemont entitled "Tax Cuts to Put America First." It was quite the bromance. I can't remember all of the things that he said about Mike Pence, but it was almost as if this was the savior of the nation come to visit Illinois. And now
I believe the phrase "greatest leaders in American history" was used with regard to the vice president.
I stand corrected.
And this is interesting because obviously for Democrats, Vice President Pence is a polarizing figure. He is known as somebody who is extremely socially conservative. He has views that are anathema to a lot of Democrats and liberals on issues relating to same-sex marriage and adoption and all sorts of things like that, as well as abortion and any other social issue. But he is very popular again with the Republican base, and so Governor Rauner, maybe this is, I don't know what's in the governor's head or his heart, but we can perhaps speculate that this is it's a way to embrace a popular conservative without having to embrace somebody who has said the disparaging things about immigrants and women and other things that President Trump has said.
Sure.
So the governor, he obviously is in a very tough situation. To put the coalition back together, got him elected, he has to appeal to the core base of Republican voters. Some of those are very socially conservative, and the kind of bargain that you had 4 years ago that, well, you can trust me on the economy and I won't rock the boat on the social issues, that pretty much was blown out of the water by the events that led up to Jeannie Ives challenging him in the primary, almost beating him. And so the governor is, he tries to have it both ways, and that can come across as nuanced, or it can come across as confused or disingenuous, and so it's not the position you want to be in. It's further complicated by some policy issues. He's in, the president is here celebrating the reopening of the steel plant in Granite City, but he's got a lot of downstate farmers and downstate politicians who are very, very nervous about tariffs and what this is doing to soybean and hog prices. And so, Trump's trade policies are pluses in one places and minuses in another, and that that just heightens the kind of the tightrope that he's trying to walk in terms of not getting caught in and it's a situation that is just. It's never going to be a win-win, and then he wants to at least try to not to be a lose-lose in terms of how he balances this.
I mean, it may be cliche, but 4 years ago, one of his big selling points was, "I'm not Pat Quinn." Now one of his problems is, "I'm Bruce Rauner," and so how do you, as you say, pick and choose? Donald Trump, I covered his campaign event in 2014. No, I stand corrected. In 2016, when he came to Springfield, I guess it's called the Bank of Springfield Center now, then the Prairie Capital Convention Center. It was the largest crowd apparently that's ever been to the Prairie Capital Convention Center, and it was fired up. I mean, it was enthused, and this was a point in time before Trump had sewn up the nomination, and nobody thought he would win. And hindsight being hindsight, perhaps we all should have said, gee, there's some enthusiasm in this room that we haven't really seen since perhaps 2008, when Barack Obama kind of got the same sorts of enthusiastic reactions out of crowds. Going back to the Trump question, yeah, Pence is not as divisive perhaps as the president, but the president still enjoys, what are we at, 80+% approval ratings from Republican voters, but then you spare that to, there's something, 40% of folks identify as Republicans, so 80% of 40%, and it pairs away somewhat. Speaking of building his coalition, he seems, the governor here, has been making some inroads, and he did very well, I think. Not very well, but better than folks expected him to do, I think, in Cook County and some of the collar counties last time around. He was up in Chicago this past weekend and appeared at a church event with Willie Wilson, who is running for mayor of Chicago. He has zero chance of winning. He's run for mayor of Chicago before, but boy, I wish I had went to church more often, given what happened last Sunday. Brian, tell us what happened there.
Yeah, Mr. Wilson, apparently he's done this before, but he basically was handing out cash. I think it was
greenbacks.
Literally cash, $200,000 worth. This is Mr. Wilson is a wealthy man. I don't actually know how wealthy, if he's sort of Bruce Rauner wealthy, or J.B. Pritzker wealthy, or
just run-of-the-mill millionaire
just run-of-the-mill,
wealthy.
Single millionaire wealthy. I really don't know. But this was billed as a sort of a property tax relief event, and then after some questions were raised, the media was there filming this thing, and it certainly is. I think a lot of people assume that Illinois politicians are frequently carrying large stacks of cash and handing them out to people.
Walking around money is what it is.
But you don't usually see that on the news. And so after some questions were raised about this, the governor said his campaign didn't really understand what was going to happen there, although other people have pointed out that this is not the first time Mr. Wilson has done this. I mean, which either raises questions about the veracity of that statement or the quality of the campaign research and vetting of this sort of thing. People were asking the State Board of Elections, where there were somewhat conflicting accounts. The General Counsel was quoted as saying it looks kind of skeevy.
Skeevy.
Which I don't believe is a word.
Skeevy.
I don't believe that that's a word that appears in the Illinois compiled statutes or the election code.
It should.
And he also said if that were the threshold for Illinois politics, this is a quote, the chambers, meaning the legislative chambers, would be empty.
Everybody be in church for the reverse collection plate.
That's right. So it's certainly something that raised a lot of eyebrows. I'll say that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, as you alluded, there is a long, I wouldn't say storied tradition in Illinois of what you refer to as walking around money, having money in the hands of precinct committeemen, of community leaders, some of those often members of the clergy, facilitating the get out the vote and getting people to the polls on election day.
We're not paying for votes, we're getting out the vote.
Yes,
Okay.
and now this, again, then in the modern communication, and when we have pictures of handing out some of this money was in the form of checks from the foundation. Some of it we were peeling greenbacks off a roll, and it looks bad. It looks like buying votes. Obviously, you can't buy votes. That does, in fact, illegal. It is illegal to give something of value to a person in exchange for their vote, and you probably couldn't bring a case in front of the State Board of Elections, but the governor has to backtrack. He gives a muddied explanation. Then, lo and behold, there is a YouTube video of him attending a similar event in the same church with the same people a year earlier, handing out the cash. And this feeds a narrative about the governor. Not always being forthcoming about what's going on and his relationships with people. So it's just not the sort of thing that you want to have when your popularity is somewhere in the. I think the governor there was a poll, an article that came out in the last couple of days that the governor is the third least popular governor in the United States. Yeah. And when you're in that position and running for re-election, you want to have good days. You don't want to have bad days. Yeah. And this made for a bad day.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, and this is not, there have been other things in this ballpark, let's say, maybe not on exactly the same dynamics, but remember back in 2014, the governor, when he was still just a citizen and a candidate, he went and made a $1 million, I guess it was a $200,000 donation and an $800,000 deposit at an African-American owned credit union on the south side of Chicago. Okay. He arrived in his old Volkswagen van. Bruce, I know you're a fan of that.
The van, we can talk about the van. The van is not as beat up or decrepit or unvalued as some might think.
Yes, but he put on his sort of man of the people get up for that day, and
Carhartt.
I don't know what he was wearing. I don't remember, but he made $1 million deposit in a credit union, and that raised some eyebrows at the time as well. Just as things he was doing to shore up support in the African American community, where he had hoped to make some inroads. Yeah. Although there are people who say that in Illinois politics, appealing to the African American community is also about making yourself, particularly as a Republican in a somewhat more racially polarized time that we're in now, making yourself appealing to moderate suburban voters too.
Yeah. Well, he bought some farmland here in Sangamon County, and nobody really bats an eye, not much of it. This raises more of a hullabaloo, and a couple things that I wonder about. It seems to me this would be much more scandalous if it had occurred the Sunday before Election Day. Sure. We're quite a distance out. The other thing is we should have mentioned is that Rauner had given Mr. Wilson $100,000 for Mr. Wilson's charitable foundation. And so part of the concern here is, did that $100,000 from the governor find its way into the hands of parishioners on Sunday, and could that then be any violation of campaign laws, the optics aside.
Well, I mean, the governor has said in another context that money is fungible, right? When talking about the various state accounts and moving money, doing fund sweeps and those sort of things. So that means that, if you put, we pay our taxes to the federal government. Can I say that my tax dollars went to fund, a couple of bolts on the deck of an aircraft carrier or something like that? No, but, everybody's money goes for everything, basically, in some way. So if he made a contribution to this foundation, then and money is handed out by the foundation, I'm not sure how much you can really differentiate that.
And I don't, if Bruce Rauner's opponent was someone who had a net worth of a couple of $100,000, we would be seeing contrasts between the rich person throwing his money around versus,
in Daniel Biss's kitchen.
Yeah, the man of the people.
Pat
I don't
Quinn
think
mowing his lawn.
yes, all of those things, and you're not, that's not going to be what decides this election. Is whether the multi-millionaire or the multi-billionaire is more a man, or less a man of the people. I mean, these are very different people and from very different circumstances than almost everybody in the state, and so money is certainly is an issue. I mean, most expensive election probably in gubernatorial election in U.S. history. That's certainly where we're headed. But it's in some ways for both candidates. It's the hurdle is, how do I make myself relatable? How do I get people to believe that I understand them and can represent them? And money's a huge advantage in terms of buying TV ads, but it does distance you from the common man, and that's always a struggle with wealthy candidates.
Well, Brian, I think you've made this point before. Once you get to a certain amount of money that you spend on ads, then there's a terminal velocity, so to speak. You can keep spending money, but once you get past a certain point, how much better position it's going to put you in is somewhat questionable. Do you still hold that view?
I've said it, and citing political science research that's been pointed out to me, and so I'm reluctant to say that in front of a political scientist, Chair, but we could just go to the source. But it's my understanding.
Well, you two just talk amongst yourselves.
It's my understanding that as long as both sides are reasonably evenly matched, the amount of money, it begins to kind of be a wash. I mean, Governor Rauner outspent Governor Quinn 2-1, and yet he only won by 5 percentage points. He didn't win by a margin, by a 2-1 margin, and that was a Republican wave year, so that probably helped push him over back in 2014. So it seems like in terms of the advertising, where both sides are going to have plenty of funding. That's an interesting aspect for the Democrats this year, especially given the Supreme Court opinion. We've seen in Wisconsin how Democrats have really taken a hit after they sort of several years ago took these actions to restrict collective bargaining in state government and really hurt the public employee unions, and then started going after the private sector unions there. But particularly this actions about public employee unions really helped dry up a lot of that as a source of money for the Democratic Party. Well, just so happens that Illinois Democrats have a billionaire 3.4 times over coming in as their standard bearer in a year when the U.S. Supreme Court has sort of knocked the legs out from one of the stalwart fundraisers in the Democratic Party.
Well, and we need to be clear that, public employee union money is substantial, and it definitely favors Democratic candidates. We're talking out of 11 million, 10.5 million going in 2 years ago to legislative candidates. But the trade unions contributed almost $31 million to legislative candidates, of which about less than $1 million of that went to Republican candidates. I mean, labor, and then you add the service employee unions and some other groups on top of that. And so the Democrats do have an advantage in Illinois in terms of raising money from the private sector, as you were, and while while public employee union money is important, the bear that you don't want to poke is the trade unions, and the governor got crosswise with them with right to work and workers' comp and a bunch of other things right out of the box. So the governor has leveled the playing field with his money, but the Democrats have absent J.B. Pritzker, they have a huge advantage and have had a huge advantage. And now that you have Pritzker in the game, that we really have changed that dynamic pretty significantly.
Sure. Well, and money aside, Rauner has been making efforts to make inroads, I think, with black voters. There's not just the Willie Wilson appearance this last week. He was at the Black Chamber of Commerce, I think the week before that in Washington, D.C. to accept a national award. What do you think his thinking might be here? I mean, and particularly with regard to Pritzker, who was caught on tape, on these Blagojevich tapes, saying not real nice things about certain black politicians in Illinois that kind of don't sound very good to a lot of folks. Is Pritzker perhaps more vulnerable than Quinn might have been?
You know, we have not really heard much about, and maybe we should be specific about what he said, because you leave a little, maybe too much to the imagination when you say the not nice things. What he had said was this was caught on a wiretap with Rod Blagojevich, supposedly secret FBI wiretap, which the Tribune somehow obtained and published, and he was caught describing potential successors for then U.S. Senator Barack Obama, who was the president-elect. Yeah. Remember, Blagojevich was going to appoint someone to that seat. Famously, he tried to sell the seat, and that's one of the reasons he was impeached and removed from office and indicted. But what Mr. Pritzker had said was that, what did he say about Jesse White? That he was something like...
He was more acceptable.
The least offensive or something, something like that.
This is the acceptable one. This is
right.
And,
Jesse White is a very popular politician in Illinois. So, he has run up huge to quote Judy Bart-Topinka, sort of like a Russian election. I can't remember, really, sort of despotic election margins in a democracy. And even in places where Democrats don't win in far southern Illinois anymore, even Jesse White has been popular there.
Sure.
So I think that's what that was a reference to. We haven't seen the governor to talk about these, using this in advertisements. Is Pritzker more vulnerable? What wouldn't surprise me if we saw that resurrected as we get closer to the campaign. The governor was running ads about this in the Democratic primary to try and weaken Pritzker, possibly help his opponents. Who knows what his intentions were there. I'm sure we'll hear more about it again. But ultimately, given everything that's happened in the past couple of years with the budget impasse, I think you would expect that voters would kind of come home this year to their party, but who knows? Things are being scrambled all the time.
Well, I think that's a critical point. I mean, if the governor was looking back at 3.5 years of developing programs, building communities, doing and saying, this is, here are the results. These are the things that I've done. Yeah. When the governor claims that he's been, he made a claim that he'd been, better for the African American community than any other Illinois governor, immediately got pushback from African American leaders in Chicago and throughout the state, and then the governor disparaged those leaders as being out of touch with their people and part of the evil, Madigan, cabal, and so I just. When we get to the election, I think you're going to see the same normal type of heavy support from the African American community. There's no organizational structure for the Republican Party within Cook County or the city of Chicago, in downstate urban areas, the same sort of thing. And so there isn't either the results or the infrastructure to really have that be a significant a significant factor in terms of, you just want to hold down the margin that you're going to lose by. And and he may have trouble doing that.
Sure, but I mean, we also should remember, I think, that Donald Trump outpolled amongst black voters. He did better than Mitt Romney did, and you know, given some of the things that Mr. Trump had said prior to the election, that was surprising to a lot of folks. So who knows? We have, of course,
just if I get briefly, I'll say, I think there's a way. This is something a Republican strategist said that I heard about a year ago. That if you think of the dominant divide in American politics right now as insider versus outsider, as opposed to Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative.
black, white.
Even black, white, yeah. If you think of insider versus outsider, that's a way of explaining the success of Donald Trump, Bruce Rauner, Barack Obama. It's the people who are not viewed as the ones who are the career politicians, the swamp, whatever you want to say, the ones who've been inside for a long time. If they can run as the outsider, they're the ones who do well. And the question is, can Governor Rauner, no longer candidate Rauner, but Governor Rauner, who's been governor for more than 3 years now, still run successfully as an outsider?
Excellent point. You know, because you look at J.B. Pritzker, he sure sounds like an insider in those wiretaps with Blagojevich, doesn't he?
And the governor's doing everything he can in his advertising to paint him as an insider by, you know, making him seem as though he's a blood relation to House Speaker Michael Madigan.
And you know, but the Democrats have nominated a candidate who has a very successful record in terms of fostering entrepreneurship, in terms of doing things with early childhood education, and someone who has you know, never had to veto a bill, never had to you know, make a propose a balanced budget.
Never took a vote that wasn't secret.
Yeah, so you know, Pritzker has, you know, if you want someone who's not, you know, who isn't a politician, then, you know, that he certainly can present that side to himself and present himself as a, you know, as a job creator, which is not exactly what how the governor made his money in terms of before he ran for office in Illinois. You know, the nuances, but you know, ultimately it may be that great political theorist Ronald Reagan. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And a lot of Illinoisans look at what's gone on in terms of state government and you know, don't answer that question in the affirmative.
Sure. I mean, I think one of Pritzker's at this point strongest points has been, look at all the money we've spent paying off not just the debt, but for interest payments. And so that's money down the drain. And speaking of down the drain, we are about out of time. And so thank you both so much for joining us, and we'll see you back here next week on Capitol View.